If you feel everything is meaningless, listen to Carl Jung on spiritual awakening. Because what you call meaninglessness is not the end, but the first tremor of the soul awakening from a long sleep. It is the place where the surface life collapses and the deeper life waits to be born. You are standing at a threshold, the quiet terror of realizing that the stories, the achievements, the masks you have worn no longer hold you. The world has gone flat, and your heart asks, why continue? And yet within this despair hides a secret. Jung wrote, the decisive question for man is he related to something infinite or not? Meaninglessness is not the absence of truth. It is the absence of relationship with what is greater than the mask you show the world. It is not a void to be feared, but the first clearing of the ground on which the self, the deeper totality of your being, may rise. You feel hollow. You feel unseen even by yourself. And this hollow ache is the voice of the shadow, the unlived part of you calling for recognition. The persona, the polished mask you wear in public, the role you play to be accepted, has grown thin and brittle. It is crumbling under the weight of your suffering, and behind it stands the one you abandoned long ago, the forgotten self, carrying all the feelings, desires, fears, and visions that you once exiled. When everything seems meaningless, it is because the false self can no longer hold. The persona cannot breathe life into you. And so life itself strips you down, forcing you to confront what you have projected outward, the anger you blame on others, the beauty you cannot claim as your own, the fear you bury in silence. The world becomes dull because your projections have withdrawn. The energy you cast upon others returns home demanding that you see it as yours. And you stand in this gray landscape uncertain whether to collapse or to search. But if you listen closely, you will feel the subtle stirrings of another voice within. The self does not shout. It waits. It draws you deeper past the walls of habit into the underworld of the psyche. This is not the death of meaning. It is the beginning of individuation, the slow, painful, luminous process of becoming whole. Consider your dreams. Even in the nights when you think you have no hope, the unconscious whispers in images: a stranger in the distance, a forgotten house, a child crying in the corner. Each figure is a fragment of you. The stranger is the part you have not yet lived. The house is the architecture of your soul, with rooms unexplored. The child is the wound you carry, waiting not for pity but for recognition. Dreams are not meaningless fantasies. They are the soul's way of reminding you that you are larger than the life you are currently living. Meaninglessness cuts because it exposes the lie of permanence. The job, the relationship, the accolades, they were never enough. And now the veil has lifted. The psyche demands more. Not more possessions, not more status, but more reality, more wholeness, more truth. And here is where the terror becomes gift. In this collapse, you are free. Free to turn away from borrowed masks and listen to the depths. Jung observed that when people ignore the inner call, neurosis often appears. The body twists the silence into illness, the mind into anxiety. But when the call is answered, when you risk looking into the darkness, something shifts. The shadow once feared reveals its treasure. The anger hides energy. The grief hides love. The fear hides courage. The parts you once fled were never your enemies. They are your raw materials for transformation. Imagine now that your soul is a vast forest. For years you have walked only the paved road, trimmed and lit for the eyes of others. But now the road ends. You stand before tangled roots, shadows shifting between trees. It is frightening. But here in the forest of the unconscious lives everything that can heal you. Here waits the forgotten voice of the anima or animus, the inner guide that bridges your conscious mind to the depths of feeling and imagination. If you are male, the anima may appear as a woman in your dreams, luminous or terrifying, reflecting your unlived capacity for feeling, intuition, and connection. If you are female, the animus may appear as a man, critical or inspiring, reflecting your untapped power, clarity, and strength. They come not as fantasies, but as reminders. Half of your soul has been neglected. The meaning you seek is not out there in another role or escape. It is born here in this very confrontation with the shadow and the guide within. Meaning is the inner marriage of opposites, the conscious with the unconscious, the light with the dark, the persona with the shadow, the masculine with the feminine, the small self with the vast self. Individuation is not about becoming someone else. It is about becoming who you have always been, but forgotten. Perhaps you ask how to move when the weight of emptiness presses so heavily. Begin not with grand gestures, but with presence. When despair rises, do not rush to silence it. Ask, what is this feeling asking of me? When envy burns, do not drown it in shame. Ask, what is the unlived life behind this desire? When grief pierces, let it pierce fully, for grief is the cry of the soul refusing to accept exile. These questions are not techniques. They are doorways. They turn the wound into a threshold. And slowly as you turn toward what you once fled, you discover that meaning is not something you create like a project. Meaning grows as a tree grows from soil enriched by decay. The very things you thought would destroy you, loneliness, despair, failure, become compost for the new life within. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. This privilege often begins in suffering when the false life collapses." Do not mistake this collapse for failure. It is initiation. It is the death of illusion and the first breath of the soul. Now, as you hear these words, notice what stirs in you. Perhaps resistance, perhaps a quiet recognition, perhaps a memory you had forgotten now rising. This is not by chance. The unconscious responds to symbols, to truths spoken aloud. You are not lost. You are being summoned. And so, though the world feels empty, though you may think there is no reason to continue, remember this: the emptiness is not a tomb. It is a womb. Something is being prepared within you, something vast, something real. The self is waiting to be born through you. You have felt the weight of meaninglessness, and yet, in turning toward it, something subtle begins to shift. The ground beneath you is no longer the smooth, polished stone of certainty, but the trembling earth of transformation. This descent into emptiness is not a mistake. It is the natural unfolding of a psyche that longs for wholeness. The collapse of what you once believed to be secure is the threshold into a deeper truth that meaning is not inherited from outside, but discovered in the depths of your own soul. You may feel as though you are wandering through a desert, parched and aimless. The horizon stretches endlessly, and each step feels the same as the last. But beneath this dry surface there are underground rivers waiting to break through. These rivers are the currents of the unconscious, always moving, always alive, though you have ignored them. The dryness you feel now is the absence of that connection. The desert is real, yes, but so is the hidden water. And your journey through this landscape teaches you to thirst for what is essential, not what is superficial. Jung often spoke of the shadow not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a companion carrying the unlived life. You resist the shadow because it exposes what you have denied. Anger, jealousy, lust, fear, these energies you learn to push away in order to survive in the eyes of family, society, or religion. You buried them, believing them unworthy, and in their place you built a mask, the persona. This persona has helped you adapt, but it has also chained you. The shadow weights heavy with the vitality you need. When you feel life has no meaning, it is often because the shadow presses against the walls of your denial, demanding entry. If you continue to refuse it, the psyche will punish you with numbness, depression, or the endless cycle of repetition. But if you open the door cautiously, humbly, something changes. You begin to see that the shadow is not simply dark. It holds the raw ore of your authenticity. Within the anger lies the energy to defend your truth. Within the envy lies a compass toward what you secretly desire to live. Within the fear lies the gateway to courage. Each rejected fragment hides a treasure. Look around you. How often do you find yourself blaming others for qualities you cannot bear? The arrogance of a colleague, the selfishness of a friend, the cruelty of a stranger, are these only theirs? Or are they also mirrors, projections of the parts you refuse to recognize in yourself? Projection is the mind's way of avoiding its own depths, but every projection is also an invitation. Each time you feel a sharp reaction, ask yourself, what is this showing me about the unlived aspects of my own being? This work is not easy. To face the shadow is to feel shame, fear, and resistance, yet every moment of recognition brings liberation. Slowly you become less fragmented, less at war with yourself. The walls begin to soften, and the energy you once wasted in suppression flows back into your life. It is not that the shadow disappears, it never does. It is that you learn to carry it with dignity as part of your wholeness. At times the shadow appears in dreams, perhaps as a dark figure, a pursuer, a monster lurking at the edge of vision. These are not nightmares without purpose. They are dramas of your inner world. The monster that chases you is the unloved part of yourself longing to be seen. The stranger who frightens you is the forgotten potential you have exiled. To turn toward them in dream or waking life is to begin the work of integration. And yet, beyond shadow, there is more. When the unconscious opens, it does not reveal only darkness. It reveals images of beauty, symbols of the self, flashes of a greater totality. In moments of quiet or in dreams, you may glimpse a mandala, a circle, a radiant figure, a child, a wise elder. These are not accidents. They are signs of the self, the organizing principle of your psyche, the inner wholeness that calls you toward integration. The self does not force itself upon you. It waits in symbols, in synchronicities, in sudden moments of profound feeling. You notice the same number appearing again and again. A stranger speaks the words you needed to hear. A dream image lingers for weeks, refusing to let go. These are not random. They are the language of the unconscious, reminding you that meaning is not gone. It is speaking in a different tongue. And here in this place, you discover something astonishing. Meaning is not found by avoiding suffering, but by entering it consciously. Pain becomes bearable when it reveals its purpose. Despair becomes transformative when you see that it was never emptiness, but the call to grow beyond the mask. Even the most devastating losses can over time carve space for a greater wholeness to emerge. It is tempting to run back to distractions, to numbness, to the shallow reassurances that society offers. But each time you turn away from your inner world, the hunger grows. And each time you turn toward it, however difficult, you feed the soul. This turning is the beginning of individuation, the process by which the small, fragile ego is drawn into relationship with the vast self. It is not about perfection. It is not about rising above your humanity. It is about becoming deeply, fully human, a vessel through which light and shadow, suffering and joy, masculine and feminine can all coexist. And as this process unfolds, you may notice subtle shifts. Colors seem more vivid. A simple moment of silence carries depth. A fragment of music moves you to tears. This is the soul awakening. Life has not become easier, but it has become real. Meaning has returned not as an abstract idea, but as a living presence. So when you feel meaning slipping away, remember, the emptiness is not a dead end. It is the dark soil where new roots form. The shadow is not your enemy, but your companion. The unconscious is not chaos, but a hidden order. And the self, the deep center of your being, is always waiting to be born more fully through you. And so the path draws you deeper through the dim corridors of the psyche where silence is heavy and time itself seems to bend. Here, you begin to sense that the true suffering is not that life lacks meaning, but that you have been living too small a story. Meaninglessness gnaws at you because the life you crafted was built upon fragments, upon partial truths. And now the soul demands more, not in possessions, not in victories, but in depth. Jung spoke of individuation as the journey of becoming whole, a union between the conscious ego and the vast, mysterious unconscious. This is not a straight line, but a spiral descent and ascent, as though you were being pulled into the underworld, only to be reshaped and returned. Individuation begins when you stop asking, "What should I do to appear valuable?" and instead begin asking, "What does my soul demand of me now?" This question may terrify you, for it requires honesty. It requires listening to the voices you have long ignored. Consider the persona you wear each day. It may be polished, admirable, successful, or pleasing, but it is not the whole of you. It is the mask necessary to navigate society. Yet when the mask is mistaken for the face, when the role becomes the identity, the soul suffocates. The collapse of meaning is often the collapse of persona. The energy you invested in being acceptable has drained away, leaving you face to face with the raw truth of yourself. And this is where the shadow comes again, not as an intruder, but as a teacher. Each quality you condemn in others, each impulse you repress within yourself, is a piece of the soul begging for inclusion. Jung insisted that no tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. This means that your greatness is born not in escaping your darkness, but in reconciling with it. Your rage, your jealousy, your despair. They are not stains to be erased, but powers to be integrated. They carry the heat that fuels transformation. Yet shadow work is not only about reclaiming what is dark. There is also the golden shadow, the luminous potential you have projected outward because you could not believe it belonged to you. The brilliance you admire in others, the courage, the creativity, the wisdom, all of it is also yours. When you feel awe, when you feel envy, when you feel unworthy in the presence of greatness, you are staring at your own rejected light. To integrate this golden shadow is to say yes timidly at first, but then with growing strength, yes, I too am capable of this. Dreams continue to guide you here. They are not meaningless images. They are the nightly theater of the unconscious. A child appears fragile and pure. This is the potential of new life within you. An elder speaks cryptic but wise. This is the self whispering from the depths. A terrifying storm approaches, tearing down the familiar landscape. This is the psyche's way of clearing the ground for rebirth. To take dreams seriously is to acknowledge that your soul is always speaking, always guiding, even when your conscious mind is lost. In this descent you will meet the anima, or animus, the inner other, who reveals what you have neglected. If you have silenced your intuition, your anima may appear demanding that you feel more deeply, that you open to vulnerability, to beauty, to connection. If you have silenced your strength, your animus may arise, demanding that you claim your voice, your clarity, your power. These figures are not mere fantasies. They are archetypal presences, bridges between the conscious and the unconscious. To engage them, to dialogue with them in imagination, or to honor their presence in dreams, is to court a deeper wholeness. The ego resists. It clings to what is known, to what is safe. It whispers better to stay numb than to face the fire. But the unconscious is relentless. It will not let you remain half alive. If you refuse the call, you will feel the weight of neurosis, the suffocation of a soul denied. But if you accept the call, even trembling, you step onto the path of transformation. Notice the paradox. The more you resist suffering, the heavier it grows. The more you open to it, the more it reveals its hidden gifts. Grief, when allowed, softens the heart. Anger, when honored, becomes protection and vitality. Fear, when faced, becomes courage. Each wound, if turned toward, transforms. This is the alchemy of the soul, the lead of suffering transmuted into the gold of meaning. And perhaps as you listen, you begin to sense that you are not alone. The struggles you carry are not yours in isolation. They are human struggles, ancient and universal. Every myth, every religion, every symbol across cultures has spoken of this descent and rebirth. Orpheus, descending into the underworld. The phoenix burning to ashes, Christ bearing the cross, all echo the same truth that meaning is born through the embrace of suffering, not the avoidance of it. You may even begin to notice synchronicities, those moments when inner and outer worlds align in uncanny ways. A dream symbol appears in waking life. A chance encounter delivers the words you needed. A symbol recurs again and again until you cannot ignore it. These are not accidents. They are the self communicating through the fabric of reality, weaving you into a larger story. Meaning is not lost. It is calling to you through symbols, through chance, through the mysterious intelligence of the psyche. And gradually, as you walk this path, you realize something astonishing. The question is no longer, what is the meaning of life, but how can I live so that life becomes meaningful? The answer is not in abstract philosophy, but in the lived experience of integration. To be whole is to live with shadow and light, with joy and sorrow, with strength and tenderness. It is to recognize yourself not as a fragment, but as a totality. This journey is not a destination, but a continual unfolding. Each time you think you have arrived, another layer emerges. Each time you think you have conquered despair, a deeper shadow waits. But with each turn you grow stronger, more authentic, more alive. And the very meaninglessness that once crushed you becomes the fertile ground from which your soul blossoms. And as you move further inward, the landscapes of your psyche begin to reveal themselves with a clarity that is both unsettling and luminous. What once felt like a barren wasteland begins to stir with hidden life. Out of the silence emerge whispers, images, long-forgotten sensations, as though the unconscious were breathing into you its ancient truths. Meaninglessness begins to feel less like a void and more like a veil, thin and trembling, concealing the living depth beneath. You realize that identity itself has been fragile, stitched together by borrowed expectations. For so long you believed you were the roles you played, the worker, the partner, the achiever, the one who always smiled, the one who always endured. But these are fragments, masks worn for survival. Beneath them lies a self that has always weighted the true center, the self that Jung spoke of, the inner totality. To awaken to this self is to recognize that you are more than your masks, more than your wounds, more than your fleeting successes or failures. And yet the journey to this self is not a straight ascent into light. It requires a descent into shadow, into all that has been rejected. Jung wrote that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This is the work before you, to turn toward the places within you that you fear most, to bring them into the circle of awareness, to say, you too belong here. When you begin to accept the shadow, something unexpected happens. The rigidity of your inner world softens. Energy once locked in repression becomes available. Emotions that once threatened to overwhelm become guides. Suffering shifts from being meaningless torment to a crucible of fire that transforms rather than destroys. You no longer fight against yourself as bitterly. You begin to sense that even your wounds carry wisdom, even your flaws contain seeds of growth. This is not a sentimental realization. It is not the shallow comfort of telling yourself everything is fine. It is the hard, trembling truth that nothing in you is wasted, not the pain, not the fear, not the longing, not even the mistakes. Each carries a fragment of the self, each a fragment of the wholeness you are meant to embody. Dreams continue to reveal this truth. A figure appears who guides you through chaos, perhaps tender, perhaps terrifying. This is the anima or animus, the archetypal guide who bridges your conscious world with the unconscious. They remind you of what you have forgotten. The anima awakens feeling, imagination, and depth. The animus awakens clarity, action, and inner strength. To meet them is to encounter your own completeness, the opposite within you, calling for integration. When you ignore these inner figures, they rise in projection, binding you to others in ways that feel fated, overwhelming, or destructive. You fall in love with an image of your anima, or you battle endlessly with the figure of your animus projected onto a partner, a friend, a rival. But when you recognize them within, when you claim them as parts of yourself, the spell is broken. Relationships begin to shift. You no longer seek in others what you have denied in yourself. Love becomes freer, less desperate, more real. This is the nature of projection. What you do not claim within yourself, you will see endlessly mirrored in others. The enemy who enrages you, the hero who dazzles you, the lover who consumes you. They all carry pieces of your own psyche, pieces demanding recognition. To withdraw projections is to reclaim your soul. It is painful because it strips away illusions, but it is liberating because it gives you back your power. Slowly, as these pieces return, you begin to feel less like a hollow shell and more like a vessel filling with something vast. Meaning returns not as an abstract explanation, but as a lived experience of connection. Connection to yourself, to others, to the archetypal patterns that pulse through human life, to the mysterious depths of the unconscious. The world once gray begins to shimmer with significance. A tree is no longer just a tree, it is a symbol of rootedness and growth. A dream is no longer random, it is a letter from the soul. A chance encounter is no longer coincidence. It is synchronicity, a sign of the self weaving your path with the larger whole. And yet the ego resists. It wants certainty, stability, control. But individuation requires surrender to mystery. It requires trust that life unfolds according to a wisdom greater than your plans. This is why so many feel despair when they first awaken. The ego cannot comprehend the vastness of the self, and so it collapses. But if you can endure the collapse, if you can stay with the emptiness long enough, the self begins to rise. The self does not arrive with fanfare. It appears quietly in symbols, in moments of profound stillness, in sudden clarity that feels as though it did not come from you, but through you. It gathers the fragments of your psyche into a living whole. It shows you that you are both the question and the answer, both the wound and the healer, both the seeker and the sought. And perhaps you begin to see now why meaninglessness is not the end, but the beginning. It is the stripping away of illusions so that true meaning can emerge. It is the silence before the symphony, the winter that precedes the spring. It is the psyche's way of preparing you for rebirth. You are not asked to escape your humanity. You are asked to embrace it fully, to live with shadow and light, joy and suffering, doubt and faith, weakness and strength. To be whole is not to be flawless, but to be real. Individuation is not the achievement of perfection. It is the courage to be yourself wholly and without disguise. So when despair whispers that nothing matters, answer not with denial, but with presence. Let the despair speak. Let it show you the masks that no longer serve, the wounds that still ache, the desires that still burn. Let it strip you bare. For only then can you feel the living pulse of the self. Only then can you discover that the meaning you sought outside has always been hidden within. And now the journey has brought you to the deepest chambers of the soul, where silence hums with a strange fullness, and every breath feels as if it carries centuries within it. You have seen how the shadow, the anima, the animus, the persona, and the self weave through your life, shaping your despair and guiding your awakening. Here at the edge of transformation, the question is no longer whether life has meaning, but whether you are willing to embody the meaning that life has been whispering into you all along. The psyche is not linear. It does not lead you neatly from suffering to joy, from ignorance to wisdom. Instead, it circles, spirals, pulls you back again and again into patterns you thought you had outgrown. This is not failure. This is depth. Just as seasons repeat, but never in quite the same way, your soul revisits wounds not to torment you, but to show you what you are ready to see now. Each return carries new layers of awareness, each repetition offering a new chance to integrate. And integration is the heart of this path. Individuation is not about exiling the unwanted parts or clinging only to what is luminous. It is about allowing all of it, light and shadow, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, to coexist in a living tension. Jung called this the conjunctio, the sacred union of opposites. This union does not erase suffering. It transfigures it. The wound remains, but it glows with meaning. The shadow remains, but it pulses with vitality. The ego remains, but it bows to the self. Perhaps you begin to notice how differently you walk through the world now. The despair that once crushed you becomes less like a wall and more like a doorway. You feel the ache, yes, but you also feel its invitation. When loneliness rises, you recognize it as the soul calling you back to yourself. When envy burns, you see it as a mirror of your own unlived potential. When grief pierces you, sense the depth of love it reveals. Each feeling becomes not an enemy, but a guide. Dreams continue to accompany you, but now you listen with new ears. A child in a dream no longer feels like an abstraction. You sense it as the symbol of rebirth stirring within. A wise elder who speaks in riddles feels less like nonsense and more like the self cloaked in mystery. Even nightmares, storms, monsters, endless chases reveal themselves as the psyche's fierce attempt to awaken you. You no longer run from these images. You walk with them, learning their language, bowing to their strange wisdom. And in waking life, synchronicities multiply. The book that falls from a shelf at just the right moment, the stranger who speaks a sentence that echoes your deepest thought, the image that reappears again and again until it feels carved into your destiny. These are not coincidences. They are the self speaking through the fabric of the world, weaving your inner life with the outer. When you recognize them, meaning blooms where once there was only randomness. The world becomes enchanted, alive with depth. You begin to realize that spiritual awakening is not escape from reality. It is immersion into reality deeper than before. It is the recognition that the sacred is not somewhere else but here, in the trembling of your own heart, in the dreams that visit you at night, in the very struggles that once seemed unbearable. The ordinary world becomes extraordinary when seen through the eyes of the awakened soul. And so, the collapse that once felt like death becomes revealed as initiation. The darkness that once suffocated now feels like fertile soil. The suffering that once seemed senseless now pulses with hidden meaning. Every descent was preparing you for ascent. Every wound was carving space for wholeness. Every shadow was guarding a treasure. The self, that deep total center of your being, is not a distant goal. It is the reality pulsing beneath every experience. Each time you turn inward, each time you allow, rather than resist each time, you claim another fragment of yourself, you live more fully as the self. Individuation is not something to be achieved in a single moment of enlightenment. It is lived moment by moment in the courage to be whole. And now you may feel a quiet but profound shift. Life itself, with all its chaos, its uncertainty, its suffering, is meaningful. Not because it offers guarantees, but because it offers you the chance to become who you are. Meaning is not given from outside. It is grown from within through the embrace of your own depths. Jung once wrote, "The sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light of meaning in the darkness of mere being." That light is not abstract. It is you. It is your willingness to face despair and discover the self waiting beneath it. It is your courage to carry shadow and light together. It is your devotion to becoming whole. And perhaps as you sit with these words, something stirs in you. A memory surfaces. A dream symbol returns. A feeling rises that you had long silenced. Do not dismiss it. Do not rush past it. This is your soul responding. This is the beginning of dialogue, the conversation between your conscious mind and your unconscious depths. You are not passive in this awakening. You are a participant called to listen, to respond, to live differently. So now, when meaninglessness knocks again, and it will, you will not collapse in despair. You will recognize it as the old mask falling away. You will see it as the self preparing to reveal more of itself through you. And instead of asking, "What is the point?" you will ask, "What is life asking me to become now?" That question is the spark of awakening. That question is the doorway into your wholeness. You are not merely surviving. You are transforming. You are not merely asking about meaning. You are becoming meaning itself. And as you live this truth, you may discover that others too are drawn to the light you carry. They see in you a reflection of their own hidden wholeness. Your journey becomes theirs. Your awakening ripples outward, unseen but undeniable. This is the gift of despair, that through it the soul awakens. This is the gift of meaninglessness, that it clears the way for true meaning to emerge. And this is the gift of Jung's vision, that your suffering is not senseless but sacred.
There's a silence that no one prepares you for. A silence that doesn't come from the absence of sound, but from the absence of identity. It arrives after the breakthrough, after the blissful high of seeing through the illusion, after the masks fall and the old life dissolves. In the beginning, spiritual awakening feels like being reborn in light. You feel limitless. You cry from a joy that has no name. The heart bursts open. The universe no longer seems like something outside of you, it pulses within you. You think this is it. You've found it. You've arrived. But you haven't. That was just the threshold, the invitation. What follows next isn't often spoken of in the stories that glamorize enlightenment. What comes next is not transcendence, but descent. And that descent is where most people feel lost, confused, hollow. Not because they've failed, but because the very self they used to identify with is gone and nothing yet has taken its place. That's the emptiness. That's the unspoken truth. Awakening doesn't fill you. It empties you. It It scrapes away the false layers so completely that for a time you walk around like a ghost in your own body, unable to recognize who you were, uncertain of who you are, and terrified to admit you don't know who you're becoming. This is the liminal space between death and rebirth. And it's here, right here, where most people abandon the path. Not because they lack courage, but because no one told them this would happen. No one explained that after the light floods in, there is a great quieting, a disorienting stillness. Carl Jung called this confrontation with the self. Not the ego self, the roles we play and names we answer to, but the archetypal self, the totality of what we are, including everything we've denied, repressed, rejected. And to stand before the self is to stand naked, stripped of narratives, achievements, spiritual posturing. The illusions of separation fall apart. You begin to see the face. You show the world is not your true face, and worse, you don't yet know what your true face looks like. You look into the mirror and see the outline of a person with no story left to tell. That is the collapse of identity, of belief systems, of all the frameworks you once used to keep yourself feeling safe and spiritual. This collapse is not the end of awakening. It is the beginning of the real journey, the journey inward, the journey downward, the spiral descent into the unconscious. And the unconscious does not greet you with clarity. It greets you with dreams, symbols, and shadows, things you don't understand, things you thought you had outgrown. You start to feel things you can't name. You begin to encounter moods that aren't yours, images that appear in meditation, uninvited memories, long buried, suddenly rising with unbearable intensity. You realize healing wasn't a straight line, it's a spiral. And you're back again at wounds you thought were already healed, only now they speak in a different language. They don't ask to be analyzed, they ask to be felt. This is why the emptiness feels so consuming. You're not just losing your old self, you're being initiated into the depth of your soul. But the soul does not emerge in clarity, it emerges in grief, in longing, in loss. You mourn relationships that no longer resonate. You question values you once held sacred. You begin to sense that you cannot go back, but you're also unsure how to go forward. You're caught in the in-between where you are no longer who you were and not yet who you're becoming. And in this space, the only voice you hear is the silence of your own becoming. The silence begins to stretch. Days feel slower. You're less reactive to the world, but also less engaged. You begin to detach, not from a place of wisdom, but because your system is recalibrating. Your nervous system is learning how to exist without the constant rush of stimulation. You're detoxing not just from media and people, but from identities. From egoic roles that once made you feel important, wanted useful. You stop wanting to explain yourself. You grow tired of trying to be understood. You begin to feel invisible in a world that only validates what it can label. But invisibility is part of the process. It's not punishment, it's purification. You're being emptied so that something new can be born through you, and that birth will not be easy. Because what is emerging isn't a better version of you, it's the true you, and truth doesn't come wearing jewelry and white robes. Truth is raw, wild, shadowed, beautiful in ways the world isn't ready for. That's why so few people complete the process of awakening, because they thought they'd be exalted. Instead, they were excavated. They thought awakening would give them answers. Instead, it took everything they thought they knew and left them alone with only the sound of their own breath and a mirror that reflects nothing but depth. You walk through this mirror, and what you find is not paradise, but paradox. The paradox that you are everything and nothing, that you are divine and deeply human, that you are infinite but bound by this body, that you can feel lightness in one breath and suffocating dread in the next, and that all of it is holy. The joy, the grief, the rage, the numbness, nothing is rejected anymore, not even rejection itself. And here in this space of radical inclusion, You begin to understand why the emptiness is sacred. It's not absence, it's presence in its most subtle, unadorned form. The presence of self. Not the self that performs, but the self that is. And you for the first time start to see your life as myth. Not as failure, not as accident, but as initiation. Every loss was a door. Every silence was a sign. Every collapse was a call to something deeper. And now the call is clear: go inward. Not to find more answers, but to lose the need for them. Not to become something more, but to unbecome everything you're not. You begin to understand that unbecoming is not a failure, it's freedom. The more layers fall away, the more silence begins to settle, not as punishment, but as invitation. The silence becomes a language, a holy presence that doesn't shout, but waits. Not for you to master something, but for you to surrender everything. And what you're surrendering is not just the ego's grandiosity, but its hidden fears. The need to be seen, to be validated, to be needed. You start to see how even your most spiritual tendencies were built on insecurity. The desire to save others, to be the wise one, the peaceful one, the enlightened one. All of it performance. And when those identities dissolve, what remains is a terrifying simplicity. You, without adjectives, without titles, without explanation. Just the raw pulsating awareness of your own being. It feels empty, but only because you were so full of noise for so long that you forgot what real presence feels like. And now, as you sit with this quiet, this strange weightlessness, you realize something profound. For the first time in your life, you are not trying to be anything. You are simply here. And yet, being here isn't easy. The world doesn't understand stillness. It sees your inward turn as depression, your silence as avoidance, your solitude as sadness. People around you may grow distant. Some may even accuse you of changing. And they'd be right. You are changing, but not in the way they think. You're not becoming someone new, you're shedding everything that isn't you. And that shedding is messy. It's not a clean, linear process. Some days you'll feel free. Other days you'll feel crushed under the weight of your own awareness. You'll notice patterns in yourself that you can't unsee. The way you deflect intimacy. The way you hide behind busyness. The way you chase what wounds you just to feel alive. This is shadow work, not as a concept, but as lived reality. Carl Jung taught that we don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And now, the darkness is no longer abstract. It's personal. You're meeting the parts of yourself you buried. The child who felt invisible, the teenager who learned to lie to survive, the adult who smiles while dying inside. These aren't just emotions, they're truths, and they demand to be honored, not fixed. But honoring them doesn't mean indulging them. It means witnessing them without flinching. It means sitting with your rage without letting it consume you. It means holding your grief without trying to numb it. It means letting the shame speak its story before you silence it with self-help slogans. In this space, healing becomes less about getting rid of pain and more about learning how to carry it with grace. You don't want to be a better version of yourself anymore. You want to be an honest one. You begin to see that growth is not about ascension, but descent. Into the body, into the breath, into the shadows you swore you'd never touch. And the deeper you go, the more you realize that the emptiness isn't punishment, it's the preparation ground for depth, for intimacy with your own soul, for a truth that doesn't scream, but whispers. And that whisper says, stop running. There's nowhere to go. Everything you've been seeking is already inside you, but it requires stillness to be felt. Not the stillness of meditation techniques, but the stillness of surrender, of letting go of the chase, the striving, the fixing. And so you begin to live differently. Slower, quieter, more present. You no longer feel the need to fill every silence with words. You no longer chase the highs that used to distract you from yourself. You start to value discomfort because you know it's real. You welcome solitude because it feels safe. You stop reaching for people who don't know how to hold you, not out of bitterness, but from wisdom. You know now that not everyone can meet you in this depth. Most people fear it. They fear the mirror you've become. Because when they look at you, they see their own unfinished work, their own shadows, their own longing for something more real. And so they distance, they criticize, they label you as too much or too intense. But you are not too much, you are simply no longer diluted. You've stopped editing yourself to fit into places that never felt like home. You've stopped begging for connection from those who only offer performance. You've stopped proving your worth because you finally feel it, not as a concept, but as a felt experience. Not because of what you do, but because of what you are conscious. Aware. Awake. Awake to the beauty and brutality of being human. Awake to the sacred ache of existence. Awake to the paradox that we are both wounded and whole, both divine and terrified, both radiant and raw. And in that awareness, something shifts. The emptiness begins to shimmer. It doesn't go away, but it changes flavor. It no longer feels like absence. It feels like spaciousness, like potential, like the infinite canvas upon which a truer life can be painted. Not a perfect life, but a real one. Built not on ideals or approval, but on authenticity. You start to create from your center. You speak when words feel true. You move when your body says yes. You let life shape you, not into something impressive, but into something aligned. You no longer resist what is. You no longer perform what isn't. And in that integrity, you begin to taste a deeper kind of peace. Not the peace that avoids pain, but the peace that includes it. The peace that knows suffering is not the opposite of awakening, it is its doorway. The peace that comes when you stop trying to escape the human experience and start embracing it as sacred. And that's the real secret. The emptiness after awakening is not something to be feared. It is the ground of rebirth, the cocoon between what was and what will be. It is the dark womb of the psyche, where the soul begins to take shape again, not as an idea, but as embodiment, as presence, as breath. You begin to trust that nothing real can be lost, that every loss was only the shedding of a false self, that every silence was a call inward, that every collapse was a form of grace in disguise. You begin to walk with reverence, not because life is easy, but because it is holy. Every moment becomes a ritual. Every breath becomes a blessing. You are not chasing divinity anymore, you are living it. Even in your confusion, even in your mess, even in your emptiness, especially in your emptiness. Because that emptiness is not the absence of self, it is the reintroduction of soul. You begin to realize the soul doesn't scream. It never has. It has only ever whispered, beneath the noise of your goals, beneath the fear that made you achieve, beneath the smile that was hiding your ache, beneath every moment you played strong while quietly unraveling inside. The soul has always spoken softly through longing, through discomfort, through that subtle knowing that something wasn't right, even when everything looked perfect on the outside. And now that everything else has fallen away, you finally hear it clearly. That voice beneath all voices, it doesn't give you a new identity to wear. It doesn't promise certainty. It simply tells the truth you are not broken. You're just no longer willing to live in illusions. And that unwillingness costs you everything you thought you needed to survive. It costs you popularity, performance, predictability, but in return, it gives you something more precious than all of that realness. Wholeness. Presence. You stop living from outside in and begin to live from inside out. You stop measuring your worth by the applause and start measuring it by your alignment. You don't care if they understand you anymore. You care if you're being true. And being true is terrifying at first. Because truth doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it feels like standing naked in the middle of your life and realizing most of what you've built was a performance. The job, the relationships, the persona, even the spirituality. It all came from the wounded place that thought, if I just become enough, I'll finally be loved. But awakening rips that root out. It forces you to see the real motivation behind your striving, not to shame you, but to free you. You begin to ask yourself deeper questions, not how do I succeed, but who am I without success, not how do I attract love, but am I living as love? Not what should I do, but what feels true to my soul in this moment, and these questions aren't answered by logic. They're answered by silence, by stillness, by the deep sacred no that rises when something is out of alignment, even if it looks perfect. By the unexpected yes that pulses in your belly when something raw and real calls you forward, even if it terrifies your mind. You begin to trust that voice. Not the voice of fear, not the voice of ego, but the voice that feels like home. That deep, intuitive knowing that lives beneath your wounds. And trusting it doesn't mean you always feel safe. In fact, it often means walking away from safety, from comfort, from the familiar patterns and people that once gave you a false sense of control. It means saying goodbye to the life you thought you were supposed to live and saying yes to the life that is actually yours. It means disappointing others so you can stop betraying yourself. It means being misunderstood, misjudged, even ridiculed because you refuse to shrink into someone you no longer are. And yes, it hurts. It hurts to let go. It hurts to be real in a world that worships image. But you hurt anyway. So why not hurt for something true? Why not hurt your way into freedom rather than numb your way into another performance? Carl Jung wrote that loneliness does not come from being alone, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. And when you awaken, this truth pierces you. You start to see that most conversations are performances, that most people speak not to connect but to distract. That real intimacy is rare, not because people don't want it, but because they're terrified of what it might expose. But you're no longer terrified. You've touched something deeper. You've seen what's behind the curtain, and now you crave depth the way you once craved approval. You don't want to be liked, you want to be known. You don't want small talk, you want soul talk. You want connection that can hold your shadows, your silence, your becoming. And when you can't find that outside, you create it within. You become the safe space you've always longed for. You hold yourself in ways no one ever held you. You stop waiting to be chosen, and you choose yourself again and again until your presence becomes the love you were always seeking. This is the sacred return. Not a return to who you were, but to who you've always been beneath the noise. The soul isn't something you find, it's what's revealed when everything false falls away. And when it begins to lead your life, doesn't become easier, it becomes real. You no longer chase high vibrations or manifest glossy dreams. You anchor into presence, into truth, into the breath. You don't try to escape the moment you deepen into it. You let it show you what you've been avoiding. You let it crack you open, and through that crack something new is born, not more knowledge, but more capacity. Capacity to feel, to hold, to witness, to stay. You become a vessel, not for perfection, but for presence. You stop asking life to give you answers, and start asking life to keep you honest. You stop needing to know where it's all going, and start trusting that the deeper you go into yourself, the clearer the next step will become. And slowly, your relationship with emptiness changes. You no longer see it as a void to be filled. You see it as a space to be honored. A sacred field where the divine breathes into you without words. You don't try to force clarity anymore. You wait, you listen, you trust, and in that trust you begin to remember what the world made you forget, that you are not here to perform. You are not here to be perfect. You are not here to fit into systems that feed on your insecurity. You are here to awaken, to burn through illusion, to become whole. To walk the path that only your soul knows, and that path begins exactly where you are, empty, silent, undone. That's the doorway. That's the miracle. That's the truth that everything you were avoiding in the emptiness was the very place where life was trying to meet you, hold you, heal you, not by fixing you, but by showing you that you were never broken. The mind still resists. Even after all this unraveling, even after the ego has lost its throne, it still whispers temptations in the dark. It still asks, what now? It still demands a purpose, a direction, a certainty. And there will be moments you're tempted to rush back to the surface, to grasp at another role, another relationship, another identity that tells you who you are. Because the silence still scares you sometimes. Because this much openness feels like vulnerability. Because even after awakening, the human part of you still longs to belong, still craves recognition, still aches to be held in ways the world rarely knows how to hold. But now you see the whisper for what it is, not truth but habit, not guidance but fear wearing the mask of urgency. And instead of obeying it, you pause. You return to the breath. You ground yourself in the moment. You remember that wholeness doesn't come from chasing, it comes from allowing. And in that, allowing, something powerful begins to root inside of you, a stillness that cannot be shaken, a clarity that doesn't need explanation, a knowing that doesn't need proof. This is what real power feels like, not dominance, not control, but presence. The ability to stay rooted in your center, even when the world spins around you. The ability to listen to your soul, even when your mind screams for answers. The ability to honor your truth, even when it costs you approval. This is the kind of power that doesn't make noise, but changes everything it touches. And it's born through emptiness, through the willingness to let life strip you of every false layer until only the essential remains. You begin to see how much you've been carrying that was never yours. Expectations inherited from wounded parents, stories passed down from cultures that fear freedom, spiritual ideas that became prisons instead of portals. And now, one by one, you lay them down, not with anger, but with reverence, because you see they were part of the journey, but they cannot come with you where you're going. This path is too narrow for baggage. It requires you to walk with empty hands and an open heart. It requires you to surrender your need to understand and replace it with the courage to feel. And feeling is the sacred art you've been learning all along. Not feeling to react or analyze, but feeling to witness, to embrace, to alchemize. You begin to understand that every emotion is a messenger, every contraction a clue, every ache a doorway. You no longer shame your sadness. You don't bypass your anger. You hold space for your grief without rushing it. You start to see that feeling deeply isn't a weakness, it's a superpower. It means your armor is gone. It means your soul is alive. It means you're no longer numbing the very signals that are guiding you home. And in this space of radical honesty, your healing deepens. Not because you're fixing yourself, but because you're no longer abandoning yourself. You no longer need others to validate your wounds. You validate them by staying with them. You validate them by letting them speak. You become the parent you never had, the lover you always longed for, the witness you always needed. And that changes everything. Because now you're not just surviving your pain, you're transmuting it, turning it into wisdom, into softness, into compassion that doesn't just extend outward but inward too. You begin to see others differently, not as threats, not as saviors, but as mirrors. Each person becomes a reflection of a part of you, some familiar, some forgotten, some feared. And instead of reacting to them, you study the reflection. You ask, what is this showing me about myself? You stop blaming, you stop projecting, you start integrating, and this doesn't make life easier, it makes it real. Relationships shift, some fade, some deepen, but all become clearer. Because you no longer pretend, you no longer shrink, you no longer tolerate the kind of love that asks you to betray yourself. You want depth or nothing. You want truth, even if it's messy. You want connection that honors your becoming, not just your performance. And when you meet someone who sees you, without trying to fix you, who can sit in the silence with you and not fill it with noise, you realize that you've come home. Not just to them, but to yourself. Because only when you've held your own darkness can you hold someone else's without fear. And this is the new way you begin to live, not from seeking, but from being. You don't chase love. You become it. You don't hunt for meaning. You embody it. You don't reach for power. You anchor into it. And in this shift, life becomes less about what you do and more about how you do it. You start to notice the sacred in the ordinary, the way the sun filters through your window, the way your breath softens when you stop trying, the way your body hums when you tell the truth. You become available to life not as something to conquer, but as something to feel, to touch, to dance with. And this availability is what transforms everything. It's what makes your presence magnetic. It's what turns your wounds into wisdom. It's what makes you a living permission slip for others to be real. Because you've gone where they're afraid to go, you've touched what they've been taught to avoid, and you've returned not as someone who has all the answers, but as someone who has stopped needing them. That's the mark of true awakening, not the certainty, not the enlightenment, but the humility, the openness, the deep, quiet reverence for the mystery. You stop performing because you realize presence is enough. You stop striving because you trust that what is meant for you will come. You stop fixing because you know nothing is broken, even the emptiness, especially the emptiness. Because now you see it clearly, it was never empty. It was always full of the self, waiting to be remembered. Waiting for you to be still enough, honest enough, brave enough to return. Not to some idealized version of spirituality, not to a perfectly curated persona, but to you, raw, unfiltered, alive, and that is the most spiritual thing you can be. And now, you stand at the edge, not the edge of a cliff, but the edge of your former self. You look back and everything behind you seems like a dream within a dream, distant, surreal, familiar, but unreachable. You feel the weight of everything you've let go, of roles that once defined you, relationships that once sustained you, stories that once protected you. And yet, despite the loss, you've never felt more whole. Because in losing everything that wasn't you, you found everything that is. Not in a sudden explosion of clarity, but in the slow, sacred unfolding of truth, through silence, through surrender, through the ache of unbecoming. You no longer look outside for confirmation. You no longer wait for permission. You no longer carry the burden of needing to be understood. You walk with quiet authority, not the kind that seeks attention, but the kind that doesn't need it. You've returned to yourself, and in doing so, you've returned to the world not as an imposter wearing a mask, but as a soul, finally visible in its full spectrum, broken and beautiful, shadowed and sovereign, empty and complete. This is the paradox. You now live with grace. You're no longer searching, and yet everything you do is a discovery. Every breath reveals something new. Every step uncovers another layer. You're not trying to be conscious, you are consciousness. And from that space, you no longer move through life as a seeker, but as an embodiment. You've become what you were chasing, not because you figured it all out, but because you stopped trying to. The need to arrive has dissolved. The obsession with being healed has faded. You now understand that healing isn't a destination, it's a rhythm, a relationship. A way of being with yourself in every moment, with tenderness, with patience, with truth. You are no longer afraid of your darkness because you've seen what lives there, your power, your creativity, your depth. The parts of you that were cast out shamed, silenced, those are now your allies. They walk beside you, not behind you. You don't exile them anymore. You listen to them. You integrate them. You thank them. Because they led you here to the place where wholeness is no longer an idea, it's your experience. And this experience changes how you live. You speak less, but when you do it, carries weight. You rush less, but when you move, it's with purpose. You desire less, but when you love, it's with your entire being. You become intimate with the present, not out of discipline, but devotion. The world feels different, not because it changed, but because you have. You don't need constant stimulation. You don't need noise to fill the void. You don't need to be everything to everyone. You're content to be fully yourself, even if that means being misunderstood, even if that means being alone, because you're no longer lonely in solitude. You are accompanied by presence, by spirit, by the vastness within you that no one else can touch, yet everyone feels when they're near you. You've become magnetic, not because you're trying to be, but because truth always draws truth. And you live in truth now, not a perfect one, but a living one. A truth that breathes with you, breaks with you, evolves with you. A truth that makes you feel more alive in your rawness than you ever did in your performances. And now, the emptiness that once haunted you becomes holy. It becomes the temple where you meet yourself again and again. Not to become anything, but to remember that you already are. The emptiness is no longer scary. It's sacred. It's where you go when the world becomes too loud. It's where you return when you forget your center. It's where you listen, not to others, not to your ego, but to the silence that never lied to you. And in that silence, you hear it now, clearer than ever, the quiet voice of your soul whispering, you made it. Not to a finish line, but to a beginning. Not to perfection, but to presence. You are not healed in the way you thought you'd be. You're not glowing with unshakable certainty or floating above your humanity. You're still human, still messy, still tender, but now you're real. And that realness is the most sacred thing you've ever touched, because it connects you not just to yourself, but to everything. To the trees, to the pain in someone else's eyes, to the ache in the collective soul of a world still asleep. You feel it all now, and instead of turning away, you stay. You open. You hold. And in that holding you realize this is the real awakening. Not the bliss, not the visions, not the mystical highs, but the ability to stay with what's true no matter how uncomfortable. The ability to love what's real even when it's raw. The ability to carry your own darkness with dignity and still show up in the world as light, not because you escaped the shadows, but because you integrated them. You don't talk about awakening anymore. You live it, in the way you breathe, in the way you walk into a room, in the way you hold space for another without needing to fix them, in the way your presence itself becomes a balm for wounds that words could never reach. You've become the medicine you once searched for, not because you studied it, but because you remembered it. Remembered what it means to be fully here, fully human, fully soul. So now when someone asks you about spiritual awakening, you don't give them answers. You don't offer doctrines or paths. You just listen. Because you know the most sacred thing you can offer is your presence. You know that truth isn't taught, it's caught. It's transmitted through energy, through silence, through the courage to be real in a world that tells you to pretend. And you found that courage not because you're fearless, but because you're tired of being anything but true. You walk the earth now with bare feet and a quiet heart. You speak less, but when you do, the words land in people like seeds. You live less from the mind and more from the mystery. You don't need to explain yourself anymore. You don't need to be understood. Because you are known, not by others, but by the self. And in that knowing there is peace. Not the peace of avoidance, but the peace of embodiment. The kind that holds space for paradox. That lets grief and joy dance together. That makes room for the questions that have no answers. That sees life not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a poem to be felt. And you now are that poem, written in stardust and shadow, etched by suffering and silence, carved by the hand of life itself. You are not empty anymore. You are infinite, not because you escaped the pain, but because you let it shape you without closing your heart. And that perhaps is the final awakening, not to rise above the world, but to meet it more deeply, to fall so far into your own soul that you emerge not as someone new, but as someone true. And in that truth, you no longer chase the light. You become it.